Picture a city of 3 million people. Now imagine that almost everything they eat is lying to them. Not slightly lying, not rounding up, not using the wrong font on a label. Lying. The bread is full of chalk, actual chalk, calcium sulfate, scraped and powdered and kneaded into the dough so the loaf looks white and plump, and costs a penny less to make. The milk has been watered down so many times it's barely milk anymore, and then, to restore the colour, someone's added chalk to that too. The tea isn't really tea, it's black currant leaves, dried and rolled and mixed with iron oxide, to give it that rich, reddish colour you associate with a good brew. The beer has been stretched with water, and to compensate for the missing bitterness, someone's added strychnine, as in the poison, as in the stuff you use to kill rats. The pepper on your shelf has plaster dust in it. Your coffee is half chicory. Your vinegar isn't vinegar, it's diluted sulfuric acid. The sweets you bought your child last Sunday, the ones that turned her tongue red, that colour comes from lead chromate. The peas at the market are that beautiful bright green because someone soaked them overnight in copper sulfate. And the gin, God, the gin. But we'll get to that. The year is 1855. You're 19 years old, and you've just discovered that you can make a living off the most unsettling truth in England. Every meal your neighbours eat is, to some degree, a minor act of chemical warfare against their own bodies. Welcome to Victorian London, a city of unprecedented wealth and unprecedented filth. A place where you could attend a symphony in the evening and step over a corpse on your way home, where the finest kitchens in the country are supplied by the most dishonest men in the country, where science is finally starting to ask the question that common people have always half known the answer to. What exactly is in this food? We're going back there tonight. Not as tourists, not with our noses held. We're living it. Every smell, every texture, every quiet horror that reveals itself under a microscope lens. I make these history stories, and honestly I never quite know what kind of person falls asleep to a detailed account of Victorian food poisoning. Maybe you're a food scientist. Maybe you're deeply anxious about what's in your lunch. Maybe you're just someone who enjoys the particular comfort of knowing that the horrors of the past are, for the most part, behind us. Or maybe you're the kind of person who will listen to a story about a man scooping plaster dust into pepper jars and think, yes, this is what I need to hear before bed. Either way, no judgment. Get comfortable. Here we go. Your eyes open to a grey ceiling. For a half second, just the briefest slice of a moment, you don't remember where you are or what day it is or what your name is or why your fingers smell faintly of acid. Then it comes back. The smell is the thing that always brings it back first. It's not one smell. It's a layered, complex, deeply committed smell. There's the chemical sharpness of hydrochloric acid from yesterday's testing. The kind of smell that lives in the pores of your skin no matter how hard you scrub. Underneath that, the coal smoke from the grate that's been burning all night, because the landlady keeps the fire going year-round, whether you want it or not. Then the particular damp of London in November, not rain, not fog, something in between. Something that seeps through the window frame and settles into the bedclothes and never fully leaves. And below all of it, something sour. Something you've been trying to identify for weeks. You think it might be the building itself. You're lying on a narrow bed in a second-floor room on Cursitor Street, Holborn, which is by any reasonable measure not a good street. But it's cheap and it's 3 minutes' walk from the laboratory, and the landlady, Mrs. Phyllis Crane, does not ask unnecessary questions about the jars you carry up the stairs. Your name is Thomas Marsh. You're 19 years old, and you arrived in London 14 months ago from Nottingham with a letter of introduction, 32 shillings, and a working knowledge of titration that your secondary school chemistry master had described as adequate, though your handwriting is appalling. Back home your mother had told you London would make something of you. She wasn't wrong, but she didn't specify what. You swing your legs off the bed. The floorboards are cold. Not just cool. Cold. The kind of cold that travels up through the balls of your feet and settles in your ankles. November in London is not a season so much as a punishment. You stand at the wash basin. The water in the pitcher has a skin of cold on the surface. Not quite ice, but considering it. You pour some into the basin and splash it on your face and gasp, because you always gasp, even knowing it's coming. Your hands in the water look strange. They always look strange now. Your right index finger has a faint yellow stain around the second knuckle from the iodine test you ran on Wednesday. The pad of your left thumb has a thin white scar where you learned, empirically, that you should always check whether a glass bottle is cracked before applying pressure. Your knuckles are dry and slightly cracked, because you wash your hands a great deal. You have to. The work demands it. You pull on your trousers, brown wool, slightly worn at the left knee, and your shirt, which Mrs. Crane boiled last Tuesday, and which now has the particular stiffness of fabric that has been treated too vigorously. You button it to the top, then your waistcoat, then your coat, which is navy and not very warm and has a breast pocket you've reinforced yourself with a doubled layer of lining because the original stitching couldn't handle the weight of what you carry. What you carry is a small notebook, a short glass tube stoppered with cork, and a folded square of white tissue paper. These are your tools. Because you are not technically a scientist. You're not a doctor or a chemist or a fellow of anything. You hold no degree and no certification and no formal standing in any institution. What you are is a collector. The walk from your room to the laboratory takes 4 minutes in good weather and 9 in bad, because in bad weather, which is most weather, the flagstones around the corner of Lincoln's Inn Fields develop a particular ice film that has already sent you down twice this autumn. You've learned to hug the wall. This morning is grey and still and damp, not raining but about to be, the sky the colour of a pewter bowl left out overnight. The street vendors are just setting up. A man with a cart of hot chestnuts at the corner, the smoke from his charcoal rising straight up in the windless air. A woman arranging bread rolls in a basket outside a baker's shop, the rolls steaming faintly. You look at the bread rolls and think about alum. You used to think about how good bread smelled on a cold morning. That was before. The laboratory is at number 42 Little Queen Street, which is not a street of scientific prestige. There's Chandler's on one side, a bootmender's on the other, and directly across the road a premises that changes business monthly and is currently a printer's. The door of number 42 is dark green and slightly warped, and requires you to lift it slightly with the handle before the latch will engage properly. You've been told this will be fixed. You've been told this since April. You push through into the narrow hall. Hang your coat on the third hook from the left. The other hooks are occupied by Dr. Ward's hat, Dr. Ward's other coat, and an apron that belongs to nobody and has been there since before you started, and make your way through to the back. The laboratory is one room, roughly 20 feet by 15, with a high ceiling and 2 north-facing windows that provide the kind of flat, even light that is ideal for observational work and miserable for everything else. The room smells permanently of chemicals, not dramatically, not like a warning, not like danger, just a constant background note, a smell so familiar that you only really notice it when you come back after a few days away. Hydrochloric acid, ammonia in small amounts, the slightly sweet trace of chloroform from the cabinet, iron sulfate, and underneath everything, the base note of a gas burner that is always slightly improperly adjusted. Dr. Ward is already here. Of course he is. Dr. Arthur Thomas Ward is 51 years old, and as far as you can tell has never slept a full night in his life. He's at the bench under the window, bent over a microscope. Not bent in the casual way of someone glancing through an eyepiece, bent in the way of a man who has forgotten there is a world behind him. His coat is off. His sleeves are rolled to the elbows, which is a habit that scandalised his previous assistant, who lasted 3 weeks and whom Ward still refers to, with a certain cold precision, as the young man with the silk handkerchief. He doesn't look up when you come in. The milk samples from Whitechapel, he says. Not, good morning. Not, how are you? Not, it's cold today. Just, the milk samples from Whitechapel. Yes, sir, you say. There are 6 of them on the secondary bench. I want a specific gravity reading on each, a fat content estimate, and then I want you to run the lime test on 3 and the iodine test on the other 3. I'm particularly interested in number 4. What's in number 4? For the first time he looks up from the microscope. He has a long face, slightly angular, with deep-set eyes that always look like they're measuring something. His eyebrows are remarkable, thick and dark and expressive in a way that the rest of his face refuses to be. That's the question, he says, and goes back to his microscope. You take off your waistcoat, roll up your own sleeves and get to work. The 6 milk samples are in small glass flasks, each stoppered and labelled in Ward's precise hand. They came in yesterday afternoon. You collected 5 of them yourself, and the 6th Ward obtained through a contact at the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary. The workhouse milk is number 4. The specific gravity measurement is simple. You have a lactometer, a long, thin instrument like a thermometer but graduated differently, and you lower it into each flask in turn and read the number. Whole, unaltered milk should fall between 30 and 35 degrees on the scale. A reading below 30 means water has been added. A reading below 25 means a lot of water has been added. Number 1, 32, acceptable. Number 2, 28, watered, not dramatically, but watered. Number 3, 25, more significantly watered. Number 4, you lower the lactometer and watch it sink, and settle. 19, you write the number in your notebook, 19 degrees. For a moment you just sit with that. 19 degrees on the lactometer means that what the Whitechapel Workhouse has been serving its infants and its sick and its elderly as milk is, in terms of actual milk content, roughly half of what it should be. The other half is water, and that's before we've discussed what's been added to compensate, because they always add something to compensate. That's the thing you've learned in 14 months of this work. The adulteration doesn't stop at cutting. Cutting gives you thin, bluish milk that no one will buy. So you restore the colour, chalk, you restore the apparent richness. You skim the cream from one batch and add it in small amounts to others. You restore the texture, you add a thickening agent. And if you want to stop the milk from going off before it sells, because London summers are brutal and milk goes off quickly, you add what the trade calls preservative. formaldehyde mostly, in small doses, enough to slow bacterial growth, not enough ideally that anyone notices, but the workhouse infants aren't buying, they're being fed, and nobody is checking what they're being fed. You run the lime test on number 4. You add a few drops of lime water to a measured amount of the sample and heat it. The precipitate that forms, what you're looking for, what you're dreading, is calcium phosphate. But mixed in with it, if you know what you're looking at, you can see the gritty, flat white particles of chalk. The precipitate in number 4 is abundant. You write it down. Your handwriting is, as noted, appalling. But the numbers are legible. That's what matters. Number 4, you call across to Ward. Yes? 19 on the lactometer. Chalk confirmed. Probable formaldehyde. I'd need the shift test to be certain. There's a pause. The scratch of Ward's pen. Run the shift test, he says. You add a small amount of the shift reagent, fuchsin decolorized with sulfurous acid, to a measured portion of the sample. Watch for the colour change. Wait. The solution turns pink. Then, slowly, definitely pink. Formaldehyde confirmed, you say. Ward writes something. You write something. Outside, the not-quite rain has become actual rain, soft and persistent, the kind that doesn't fall so much as settle. You think about the infants, the old men in the workhouse dormitories, the sick women in the infirmary, all of them drinking this, all of them trusting that milk is milk. By 10 o'clock, the rain has eased to a damp suggestion of itself, and Ward sends you out to collect today's samples. This is the part of the work that requires what Ward calls institutional invisibility. What this means in practice is, you dress like someone buying food, you behave like someone buying food, and you buy food. You take 7 shillings and a set of small glass vials in your coat pocket. 6, each with a stopper, each marked with a letter in grease pencil. And you head to the market. The nearest one is on Leather Lane, 10 minutes north, and it's already in full morning roar. The sound hits you before you're even in the street. Voices stacked on top of voices, the particular high-pitched call of the vegetable sellers, the lower rasp of the meat men, the periodic clatter of crates being set down on cobblestones. Underneath it all, a kind of organic, complicated smell that is somehow both the smell of food and the smell of the city's digestive system at once. Rotting cabbage leaves underfoot, the iron and cold smell of the butcher's stall, sweetness from the confectioner's table, sugar and something else, something chemical and slightly wrong, though to anyone who hasn't spent 14 months learning to smell for wrong things, it just smells like sugar. You're looking for specific things today. You want a bread sample, not from the good baker on Holborn, but from one of the tray sellers, the ones who carry their bread in baskets under a cloth. You want a tea sample, and not the expensive kind. You want pepper, cayenne if possible, and you want a sample of the boiled sweets that the confectioner on the corner sells to children for a farthing each. And Ward wants you to find a sample of cheap gin. Not from a pub, he said, from a gin shop, the kind with a wooden counter and no seats. You know the kind he means. Everyone in this city knows the kind he means. The bread seller is a woman in her 40s, red-cheeked and fast-moving, with a basket of small loaves that she's selling at a penny each. They look good. They smell good. That warm, yeasty, slightly complex smell that bread has when it comes out of an oven. You buy 2, wrapping them in the paper she offers, and as you take them you squeeze the crust gently with your thumb. It has a certain springiness that isn't quite natural. You've learned what alum does to bread dough. Alum is potassium aluminium sulfate, and bakers add it for the same reason they add anything. It makes inferior flour behave like superior flour. It whitens the dough. It improves the rise. It makes a loaf from second-rate adulterated grain look and feel like something it isn't. The bread might be a third chalk by weight. The flour itself may be stretched with bean flour, or potato starch, or ground rice, or plaster of Paris. The average London labourer eats bread at almost every meal. You put one loaf in your satchel and eat a small piece of the other as you move deeper into the market, because you're hungry and because Ward hasn't got to a convincing solution to the ethical problem of investigating your breakfast. It tastes fine. It tastes like bread. It tastes like every bread roll you've ever eaten. That's the thing you're learning. That's the core horrible thing about all of this. It tastes like nothing is wrong. You find the tea at the third stall, a narrow dark-fronted premises with sacks leaning against the outside wall, and a handwritten sign, finest Bahia and Kongu teas, mixed, wholesale and retail. The tea is sold loose, by the ounce, into paper twists. You buy 2 ounces of the cheapest blend, 4p for something the woman behind the counter calls family tea, which is a phrase that has come to mean, in Ward's taxonomy of euphemisms, we would prefer not to specify the botanical origin of this product. You know what you're probably going to find when you test it. You've tested enough cheap tea to have developed a sort of grim predictive skill. The microscope will show the leaves aren't all Camellia sinensis. They'll be mixed with dried sloe leaves, elder leaves, dried hawthorn, the occasional iron filings to add weight. The colour will be maintained with black lead, or iron vitriol, or catechu. Or, in the more ambitious operations, with Prussian blue, a pigment that contains potassium ferrocyanide and should not, by any reasonable medical standard, be in your morning cup. But you buy it, and you put it in the vial, and you write F on the stopper with the grease pencil. The pepper takes longer to find, not because there's no pepper, there's plenty, but because you want one of the ground varieties, the premix cayenne that comes in a paper envelope, the kind that housewives buy because it's cheaper than buying whole peppers and grinding your own. You find it at a spice stall run by an older man with a spectacular grey moustache who clearly finds your careful examination of the packet suspicious. You buy 2 envelopes, 1 cayenne, 1 mixed pepper, and his suspicious expression follows you as you walk away. The mixed pepper will almost certainly contain floor sweepings. This isn't speculation. The 1820 report by Frederick Ackham, a treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons, documented ground pepper containing coconut shells, dried berries from Lathyrus sativus, and, in one sample that remains legendary in Ward's recounting of it, what appears to have been a significant quantity of mouse droppings. Ward keeps a copy of Ackham's treatise on the shelf above his bench, alongside the relevant volumes of Ure's Dictionary of Arts and a collection of Hassel's articles in the Lancet. He refers to Ackham's work the way other men refer to scripture, respectfully, frequently, and with the awareness that the world has not significantly improved since it was written. Ackham published in 1820. It is now 1855, 35 years. The pepper almost certainly still has mouse droppings in it. The confectioner sells hard candy from a wooden tray lined with oilcloth. The sweets are bright, red and yellow, and a vivid, saturated green that you've learned to treat the way you'd treat a warning sign on a piece of industrial equipment. That green. You've tested green sweets before. The colour comes in the cheaper confections from copper arsenite, also known as Shields green, a pigment used in wallpaper and fabric dye, and now apparently in the penny sweets that children suck on their way home from school. In larger quantities, copper arsenite is a poison. In the quantities found in a single sweet, it's probably not acutely dangerous. Probably. The word probably is one you've come to inhabit with a great deal of discomfort. You buy a small paper bag of the mixed sweets. The confectioner, a heavy-set young man with a cheerful face and flour on his apron, says lovely day for it about the weather in the tone of someone who says this regardless of the weather, and you agree that yes it is, and you put the bag in your satchel. The last errand is the gin. You've been to gin shops before, but never comfortably. Not because of the drink itself. You have no particular objection to gin as a concept. But the gin shops in the poorer neighbourhoods have a specific atmosphere that is difficult to describe without sounding either condescending or dramatic, and you've found that both of those things are insufficient to the reality. The one Ward directed you to is on a court off Drury Lane, down a short alley between a butcher's and a chandler's. The smell of the alley is predominantly offal and candle wax, and then you push open the low door and the smell becomes gin. Not good gin. The good gin, the gin from proper distilleries, the gin that middle-class people drink in their parlours, that has a specific, clean, botanical smell. Juniper, primarily cut with coriander or angelica. Something herbal and sharp and not unpleasant. This does not smell like that. This smells like something that was once in the same industrial building as gin, and has subsequently been diluted with water, and then had something added to compensate for the dilution. It's a headache in vapour form. It has a faint sweetness under the sharpness, and something that you've learned to recognise as oil of vitriol, sulfuric acid, added in tiny quantities to simulate the bite of genuine rectified spirit. The room is not large. There's a wooden counter running the length of one wall, behind which a man in his 50s stands with the expression of someone who has heard every story already. There are no chairs. There's a damp sawdust floor and 4 people distributed around the room in various arrangements of standing and leaning, all of them drinking. One of them is a woman in her 30s who is moving with the careful precision of someone who's been awake for a very long time and is maintaining consciousness through a combination of will and gin. She's standing with her back against the wall, her eyes half open, holding her glass with both hands. One is an old man in a coat that was once good and has since been through considerable hardship, drinking with methodical determination, staring at a point in the middle distance. The other 2 are younger, boys almost, though hardened-looking boys, who are sharing something between them and speaking in low voices. You go to the counter. You ask for a penny glass. The man pours it from a large earthenware jug. The liquid is clear and slightly viscous in a way that genuine gin is not quite viscous. You take the glass, produce your vial from your pocket when his back is turned, and pour most of the gin carefully into the glass container, stoppered it, and then add a small amount back to the glass so it looks approximately right. You put coins on the counter. You leave. Outside in the alley, you notice your hands are slightly unsteady, and you think for a moment that it's from handling the gin before you realise it's not. It's from the woman with her back to the wall, the careful, exhausted precision with which she was standing. You have a working hypothesis about what's in the gin that will be confirmed or refuted in the lab, but the hypothesis is that this particular batch, and it's not unique, Ward has notes on dozens of similar samples, has been stretched with water, flavoured with oil of turpentine for body, acidified with sulfuric acid for bite, and sweetened with sugar of lead. Sugar of lead is lead acetate. It's sweet. it's also a heavy metal poison. The woman against the wall may be drinking it every day. You write G on the stopper. You walk back to the lab. The afternoon is testing. Not testing in the emotional sense, though there's always that. Testing in the literal sense. The samples go through the sequence Ward has established over years of practice, a systematic interrogation of each substance that starts with visual inspection and works down through specific gravity, colour reactions, microscopy, and, where Ward thinks it's warranted, full chemical analysis. You're doing the bread first. You cut a thin slice from your sample and press part of it into a shallow glass dish with a few drops of water, letting it hydrate back to a paste. Then you take a small portion of that paste and prepare a microscope slide. Spread it thin, let it dry slightly, add a drop of iodine solution to stain the starch. Under the microscope, the starch granules in pure wheat flour have a distinctive shape. Elliptical, with a faint hilum at the centre, a characteristic pattern of layers visible when the light hits them right. You've looked at enough wheat starch slides now that you can recognise them immediately. You can also recognise what isn't wheat starch. You adjust the focus slowly, moving across the slide. There, the smooth, featureless fragments, chalk, calcium sulfate in its powdered form, insoluble, inert, passing through the digestive system without contributing nutrition but also without, in small quantities, actively poisoning anyone, just filling space, just replacing flour. There, the irregular, boxy granules of bean flour, a cheaper filler, fine to eat but misrepresented as wheat. And there, and this is what makes your stomach contract slightly even after 14 months of this work, the flat, angular crystals of alum, potassium aluminium sulfate. You can tell alum under a microscope by the way it catches the polarized light, by the particular geometry of its crystal faces. What does alum do? It does what Ward explained to you in your first week, in the flat, even voice he uses for facts he finds disturbing. Alum contracts the gut. In adults with a normal diet, in small doses probably not acutely dangerous. In children, in the elderly, in anyone already malnourished, in anyone already sick, in anyone whose diet consists primarily of bread because they can't afford anything else. Over time, over years, it damages the intestinal lining. It interferes with the absorption of nutrients that are already scarce. He'd paused. His remarkable eyebrows had done something complex. The working classes of this city are eating chalk and alum at every meal and wondering why they're sick. You sketch the crystals in your notebook. Draw the shape of the bean starch beside the wheat starch. Label them. Note the approximate proportions. Your handwriting is still appalling, but your drawings are actually quite good. Ward said so once, which, from Ward, is approximately equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. The tea is next. You prepare a microscope slide from a few dried leaves, and the picture that emerges is a botanic argument in miniature. The characteristic curved, papillose-surfaced leaf fragment of actual Camellia sinensis is outnumbered by a population of different leaf structures. Slow, elder, the wide flat cells of dried hawthorn, and finely distributed through the whole sample, a granular reddish-brown material that, under higher magnification, has the distinctive cubic crystal structure of ferrous sulfate, iron vitriol. For colour, you test it chemically. A drop of ammonium thiocyanate turns the solution blood red, confirming iron in soluble form. You write it in the notebook. Draw the crystal shapes. Note the colour of the reaction. The tea is not dangerous in the way the gin will be dangerous, but it's been sold as something it isn't. The people buying it think they're buying a stimulating beverage with specific properties they want. They're buying leaf litter with iron filings in it. The pepper. The cayenne pepper, when you examine it under the microscope, reveals itself to be a complex of genuine pepper particles. You can identify them by the characteristic red oil bodies, mixed with a substantial proportion of fine red ochre, ferric oxide, a pigment, and what you determine through some careful elimination to be ground red brick dust. Brick dust. You write it down. Red brick dust. You sit with the words for a moment. Ward comes to stand beside you and looks through the eyepiece, says nothing for 30 seconds. Brick dust, you say? What does ground brick dust do to the digestive system? Depends on the quantity, Ward says. In the short term, irritates the mucous membrane. If the particle size is fine enough, it may pass through without causing acute symptoms. Over years, with regular exposure. He stops. Over years, you prompt. The lining of the digestive tract is not infinitely resilient, Ward says, and goes back to his bench. Let me explain for a moment the economics of this, because this matters. Because without the economics, it's just random cruelty, and it isn't random cruelty. It's rational, predictable, market-driven cruelty, which is in some ways worse. You understand this because Ward has explained it to you, and because you've worked it out yourself in the long evenings when you sit with the notebooks. A baker in 1855 buys wheat flour for a certain price per stone. His competitors buy the same flour. The loaves they produce are roughly the same. The market price for a penny loaf is approximately the market price for a penny loaf now. If your competitor is adding chalk to his dough at a ratio of 1 part chalk to 10 parts flour, chalk being almost worthless, flour being relatively expensive, then his cost per loaf is lower than yours. He can undercut you. Or he can sell at the same price and make a larger margin. Either way, he wins and you lose. So you have a choice. You can refuse to adulterate, sell honestly, and either cut your margins to the bone or raise your prices and lose customers. Or you can adulterate too. The market selects for adulteration. The tea merchants face the same calculation. The pepper men, the confectioners, the gin distillers. Everyone in the food supply chain is operating under the same logic. Adulteration is cheaper, and there's no effective penalty for it, and the customer cannot tell the difference without laboratory equipment that most customers do not own. And at the bottom of this chain, at the end where the adulterated food is actually consumed, are the people who can afford the cheapest version of everything. The people who buy the penny loaf, not the twopenny. The people who buy family tea, not Darjeeling. The people who drink the gin from the court off Drury Lane. The rich are not immune. Ward has tested samples from establishments that serve the wealthy and found problems there too. But the rich are better fed generally, eat more variety, have stronger constitutions, see doctors who ask about their diet. The adulteration at the top of the market is usually less severe because the premium tier competes on quality. At the bottom, they compete on price. And price means chalk. Price means brick dust. Price means lead. You've thought about this a lot. You think about it particularly when you walk through the market and look at the faces of the people buying the food you're testing. The women in the worn coats carefully selecting the cheapest bread. The men buying their twist of tea. The children clutching farthings for sweets. All of them trusting that if it's for sale, it's probably safe to eat. That trust is currently not warranted. It's late afternoon, almost 4 o'clock. The November light already failing to a blue-grey dusk, when you get to the gin. Ward runs this test himself. Not because you can't do it, you could, but because Ward likes to see the gin samples himself. He has what you've come to think of as a professional personal relationship with gin adulteration. It's the one area where his careful, measured manner develops a slight edge. He draws a measured amount of the sample into a glass pipette and holds it up to the remaining light. Turbid, he says, slightly. A tiny cloudiness in the liquid, barely visible. If you didn't know to look, you wouldn't see it. He adds a drop of ammonia. The cloudiness increases very slightly. He adds a drop of lead acetate solution. The liquid develops a faint white precipitate. He nods. He doesn't say anything yet. He transfers a portion of the sample into a small flask and begins a slow distillation, heating it carefully with a spirit lamp, collecting the distillate. The room fills with the smell of the gin, that strange, wrong-sweet chemical note that you noticed in the shop itself. At close range, in a small room, it's stronger. It has a faint industrial quality, like the edge of a tannery. Oil of vitriol, you say. I could smell it in the shop. Yes. Ward is watching the flask. What else? The lead test. You stop. Lead acetate in the gin itself. Run it again on a fresh portion. You do. The precipitate forms again, white and definite. Sugar of lead, you say. It comes out flatly. You don't mean it to be flat, it just is. Sugar of lead, lead acetate, has been used to sweeten wine and cider and cheap spirits since Roman times. It's sweet. It doesn't have the bitterness of most lead compounds. It dissolves easily in alcohol, and its toxic effects, unlike arsenic or strychnine, are slow. They accumulate. Weeks, months, years of low-level exposure, and then pain in the extremities, weakness, confusion, paralysis. What's the concentration, you ask? Ward finishes his distillation, runs a separate colorimetric test, calculates from the result, writes a number. He shows you the page. You look at the number. It is below the acutely fatal threshold. It is well above what anyone would call safe. That's a daily drink, you say. For some people, a daily drink. For some people, Ward agrees, multiple daily drinks. You think about the woman against the wall with her careful, exhausted precision. What does chronic lead poisoning look like, you ask, even though you know? Ward looks at you with the expression he sometimes gets, not unkind, not warm, somewhere between assessment and something more complicated. You know what it looks like. You do. You've read the medical literature. Peripheral neuropathy, numbness and weakness in the hands and feet, the wrist drop that the Victorian physicians called wrist drop with a blunt accuracy, abdominal pain, constant and wearing, cognitive decline, the gradual unravelling of a person's ability to do the things a person needs to do. It looks, in a working-class woman in 1855, like being worn out by poverty, which she also is. The two things wear the same face. Will the report include this batch, you ask? Yes. Will anything happen when the report is published? Ward is quiet for a moment. He's been quiet in this way before when you've asked questions like this. It's the particular quiet of a man who knows the answer but finds it unsatisfying. Something will be said, he says finally. Letters will be written. There may be a parliamentary discussion. The gin shop owner will likely not be named, and if named will likely face no penalty, because there is currently no penalty for this specific form of adulteration in this specific product class. He pauses. But the report will exist. The data will exist. And data accumulates. That's what we're doing here, Thomas. We're accumulating data until the pile of it is large enough that it cannot be ignored. He goes back to the flask. You go back to your notebook. Outside, the November dark has finished arriving. The candles in Mrs. Crane's window across the road have been lit. The rain is back. Proper rain this time. Not the damp suggestion of this morning, but real, purposeful rain. The court behind the laboratory will be a river of mud by morning. You dip your pen and start writing up the day's findings in the official log. The ink is slightly too cold and drags on the paper. You write anyway. Ward dismisses you at 6, which is early for him and means he has somewhere to go. He's presenting a preliminary summary of the milk findings to someone at the Medical Society. He's vague about the details, and you've learned not to press. And he puts on his hat and his good coat and leaves with the air of a man going into battle. You bank the laboratory fire, wash the equipment that needs washing, put the day's samples in the cool cabinet in the hall, lock the cabinet, lock the laboratory door, and walk back to Cursiter Street. The rain has made the streets into something between a road and a canal. The gutters are running fast, carrying the city's topsoil and its garbage and its horse manure in a brown torrent toward the drains. You walk close to the buildings, picking your route carefully, feeling the cold water come in over the top of your left boot at the third puddle, even though you thought you'd judged the depth correctly. You haven't eaten since the piece of bread at the market this morning. Your stomach is making pointed comments about this. There's a cook shop on the corner of Holborn that does a mutton broth for £1.50, and you're heading there when you pass the entrance to Argyle Street and hear the child. Not hear, exactly. More, become aware of. A thin, continuous sound that registers before you identify it as crying, because it's not the energetic crying of a child who wants something, but the low, exhausted crying of a child who has been at it for a long time and has stopped expecting it to produce results. You stop. There's no reason to stop. You're 19 years old and tired and hungry and cold, and there is no professional obligation here. Nothing that falls within your role as a collector of food samples. Nothing that Ward has asked you to investigate. You stop anyway. The child is in a doorway 3 houses into Argyle Street. A girl, maybe 7 years old, wearing a coat too big for her and shoes that are wrapped in a cloth because the soles have failed. She's sitting on the doorstep with her knees pulled to her chest, and the crying is very quiet. "Are you locked out?" you ask. It seems like the most obvious possibility. She looks up. Her face is pale in a way that has nothing to do with the cold. Not the pinkish pale of someone chilled, but a greyish pale, the kind of pallor that looks like the colour has been slowly extracted over time. Her eyes are slightly sunken. "Mam's sleeping," she says. "Can you wake her? She's been sleeping a long time." You feel something shift in your chest, a particular unease. "How long?" "Since dinner. It's night now." "Since dinner. It's 7 in the evening. If her mother ate at noon, she's been asleep, or unconscious, for 7 hours. "What's your name?" "Meg." "Wait here, Meg." You knock on the door. No answer. You knock harder. The door isn't locked. It swings open when you lean against it. The latch loose, the wood swollen with damp. Inside is a narrow hall, stairs on the left, and ahead a small ground floor room. The woman is on the floor. She's breathing. You can see that immediately, the rise and fall of her chest. But she's not asleep in any normal sense. She's deeply, unreachably unconscious, curled on her side near the cold fireplace, a cup knocked over beside her, a smell in the room that you recognise immediately. Gin. But underneath the gin, The specific wrong sweet gin that you spent the afternoon testing? Something else. Something that makes the inside of your nose contract. You crouch beside her, touch her wrist. Pulse present, irregular. Her skin is cold and clammy, and her lips have a slight bluish tint that is not the blue of cold, but the blue of oxygen not quite reaching where it should. You've read about this. You know what this looks like in the medical literature, though you've never seen it in a person before. She's not drunk. Or not only drunk, she's poisoned. You run to the main street, stop the first person who looks like they might know the neighbourhood, a shopkeeper locking up his premises, and ask for the nearest surgeon. He tells you. You run. The surgeon is a brisk man named Gallagher, who comes with his bag and his coat only half buttoned and kneels beside the woman and does things you can't entirely follow in the dim light. He gives her something. He asks you sharp questions about what she drank and when. He sends the girl, Meg, who has followed you inside and is standing against the wall watching everything with that terrible quiet, to the neighbour's house. You stand in the doorway and answer his questions and think, with a cold, building certainty, about the sulfuric acid and the lead acetate in the vial labelled G in your coat pocket. Do you know what she drank? Gallagher asks. I have a strong hypothesis, you say. He looks at you. I work with Dr. Ward, you say, at the laboratory on Little Queen Street. We tested a gin sample this afternoon from a shop on the court off Drury Lane. And it contained sulfuric acid and what appeared to be lead acetate at a concentration that... You stop. Choose your words carefully. At a concentration that, with sufficient quantity consumed, could produce the symptoms I'm seeing. Gallagher looks at you for a long moment. In the candlelight, his face is all planes and shadows, unreadable. She's not the first, he says. I've had 3 others from this street this year, all women, all with the same presentation. I attributed it to gin, simply, to the effects of chronic alcoholism in someone malnourished. He pauses. I didn't know there was sulfuric acid in the gin. Most people don't. Will Ward's report? It'll include this batch, you say. I'll make sure of it. The woman on the floor makes a sound. Not a word, not quite consciousness, but a sound. A sign that something is trying to come back. Gallagher looks at her, then at you. Write it up, he says, whatever you have. Write it up tonight and bring it to Ward tomorrow. If there are 3 others from this street. He stops again. If there are 3 others, you say, there are more on other streets. He nods, and you don't need to say anything else. You don't go to the cook shop. You go back to Cursiter Street, eat the bread you bought this morning, which is stale now and tastes faintly of chalk and probably is, and sit at the small table under your window and write. You write for 2 hours. Your candle burns down to a stub and you light another from Mrs. Crane's supply in the hall cupboard, which she has told you is for emergencies only. This, you decide, qualifies. You write up everything you observed in the woman's room. The bluish lips, the cold skin, the irregular pulse, the smell, the type of premises where she presumably obtained the gin. You cross-reference it with the afternoon's lab notes, the sulfuric acid identification, the lead acetate concentration, the specific gravity reading of the sample. You draw a small diagram of the crystal structure of the lead acetate precipitate. Your handwriting remains appalling. Your drawing is genuinely very good. You write, at the bottom, if this shop's output is representative of the product available in this district, and there is no reason to suppose it is exceptional, then the population of women and men consuming this product daily are being systematically poisoned by lead at a dose sufficient to produce cumulative neurological damage. And in cases of vulnerable individuals or higher consumption, acute toxic episodes consistent with the presentation observed this evening in the case of one adult female, Argyll Street, Holborn. You put down your pen. Your fingers are stiff from the cold and the writing. You flex them. Feel the slight resistance in the joints, the tiredness in the muscles of your hand. It's very quiet. The rain has stopped. Outside, a watchman is calling the hour. 11 o'clock and a cold night. You sit at the table for a while, not writing, just sitting. Meg's face. The quiet crying that didn't expect results. The mother on the floor with her bluish lips. The man with the spectacular grey moustache who was suspicious of your careful examination of his pepper envelopes. The woman selling bread rolls in the morning, the rolls steaming, smelling of warmth and yeast and ordinary life. The merchants at every level of this supply chain, none of them entirely malicious, most of them just making the rational economic calculation. Adulteration is cheaper, the penalty is non-existent, the customer cannot tell, and at the end of the chain, this. Ward arrives at the laboratory the next morning before you do, which means he's been there since at least 7, which means his meeting at the medical society either went very well or very badly, and he's working through the energy of either outcome. When you come in, he's at the secondary bench with your notes spread around him, and he's written several things in the margins in his small, precise hand. "Sit down," he says. "You sit. You went to the scene." Not a question. "I heard the child." "Yes." He's looking at your diagram of the lead acetate crystal structure. "Good drawing." "Dr. Gallagher was there. He said he's had 3 similar presentations from the same street this year." Ward nods slowly. "I know Gallagher. Good man. Careful." He sets the notes down. "The Ackham problem," he says. You've heard him use this phrase before, but never asked what it means precisely. Frederick Ackham, Ward says, published his treatise in 1820 and became, briefly, the most hated man in the English food trade. He named names. He listed specific establishments by name in his published findings. He was precise. He was correct. He was methodologically impeccable. A pause. What happened, you ask, though you have a feeling? He was forced out of his position at the Royal Institution on a charge of mutilating library books, a charge that was, to put it charitably, selectively prosecuted, and that his enemies in the trade had worked to arrange. He was prosecuted, faced imprisonment, and fled to Germany. He spent the rest of his life there. Ward stands up, walks to the window, looks out at the grey morning. He has his hands behind his back and his shoulders are very slightly set in the way they get when he's working through something difficult. He was right about everything, Ward says. Every finding, every identification, every named adulterer, all correct, and it ended his career and nearly ended his freedom. But Hassel, you begin. Hassel was more careful about the naming. The Lancet investigations named products, not always people. There were still lawsuits threatened. There was still pressure. He turns from the window. The food trade in this country has very effective solicitors and very sensitive feelings. And if you publish the gin findings, if I publish the gin findings with the lead acetate concentration data and the clinical correlation from Gallagher's observations, he stops. The shop owner will have a solicitor who will argue that our testing methodology is flawed, that the sample may have been contaminated in collection, that the clinical presentations Gallagher describes have alternative explanations. But the data is correct. I have no doubt about that. His eyes are doing that measuring thing again. The question is what the data can accomplish in the current legal environment, which is, to be specific, not a prosecution, not yet. What it can accomplish is pressure, public pressure, parliamentary attention, the slow, grinding accumulation of evidence that becomes, eventually, impossible to ignore and impossible to legislate around. He comes back to the bench, picks up your notes again. This is very good, he says, the clinical observation especially. Keep the woman's name out of it, and Gallagher will agree, so keep every other detail. He sets the notes down with a finality that means, we're done discussing it, we're working now. Bread samples are next, he says. I want to expand the geographic coverage. I need samples from at least 4 other districts before the end of the week. You take out your notebook, you start a fresh page. London in 1855 is not one city. It is 10 or 20 or 30 cities overlapping each other, each with its own food supply chain, its own markets, its own patterns of adulteration. Ward has mapped this in the way he maps everything, systematically on a large sheet of paper pinned to the wall between the windows, with different coloured marks indicating different adulterants and their concentrations by district. Chalk in the bread is city-wide, but the concentration varies. In the wealthier areas, Mayfair, Belgravia, parts of Marylebone, the chalk content in bread samples runs between 8 and 12% by weight. Significant, but not dramatic. In Whitechapel, Southwark, parts of Lambeth, and the courts and alleys around Seven Dials, the concentration in the cheapest bread runs between 25 and 40%. In some samples from the worst areas, bread that is sold as wheat, bread is more than 1/3 chalk by weight. 1/3 chalk. What does this mean practically? A labourer who works a 12-hour shift and eats primarily bread to maintain the caloric load necessary to work a 12-hour shift is, in the worst cases, getting roughly 2/3 of the calories he thinks he's getting. The rest is calcium sulfate, passing through him without nutrition, doing nothing useful, and possibly doing harm to the lining of his gut along the way. This man is hungry. He buys more bread. The bread is still 1/3 chalk, and he's paying for chalk at the price of bread. Ward has calculated, in the margins of a document you found while tidying the secondary bench one afternoon, that if you take the average price of chalk, the average price of wheat flour, and the average ratio of chalk to flour in the cheapest bread samples, then the London bread trade as a whole is extracting, conservatively, somewhere in the region of £200,000 per year from its poorest customers in exchange for nothing. Chalk they're already eating, chalk from the walls essentially, chalk the city is built on, £200,000 per year in exchange for calcium sulfate. You've copied this calculation into your own notebook. You look at it sometimes when the work feels abstract. You spend 3 days doing market rounds. Morning rounds this time, you've learned that earlier is better, because the goods that move first in the morning are the goods that the vendors are most confident in, and the goods they're most eager to move later in the day are the ones that are older, more questionable. Bread from Southwark, 31% chalk by weight, alum confirmed by microscopy. Bread from Bermondsey, 27% chalk, alum, and something Ward identifies as bone dust, phosphate of lime from processed bone, used as an additional whitening and bulking agent. Bone dust, in your bread. You write it down, you keep writing. Tea from a stall in the Borough Market, 40% non-Camellia sinensis leaf matter, including what Ward's microscopy identifies as dried tea grounds that have been dried and re-rolled and sold again. used tea, sold as fresh tea. You think about all the servants in the grand households who save their masters' used tea leaves and sell them on. You think about those leaves ending up in family tea and sold back to the kitchens of slightly less grand households, and then saved again and sold on again. Tea that has been steeped so many times its caffeine is essentially hypothetical, coloured back to dark with iron vitriol, re-rolled to look like it's never been touched. The peas you test from a market barrow in Bermondsey are the worst. Not in terms of what they'll do to a person who eats them, not immediately, but in terms of the sheer deliberateness of the intervention. The peas are bright green, vivid, saturated, unnatural green. The green of something that should be making you slightly cautious. You don't need a microscope for this one. You drop a few peas into a dilute solution of ammonia and watch them turn brown. The green isn't chlorophyll. The green is copper sulfate. The vendor has soaked these peas overnight in a solution of copper sulfate to restore the colour that dried or old peas have lost. The peas themselves, under the bright wrong green, are greyish and soft, old stock that wouldn't sell in their natural state. Copper sulfate in small doses causes nausea and vomiting. In large doses, in children especially, it can cause severe intestinal inflammation and, in extreme cases, liver damage. The bright green peas go in the vial. You go back to the lab. You pass the Argyle Street, turning on your way. You don't stop, but you look. The doorstep where Meg was sitting is empty. You don't know what happened to her mother after that night. You hope it was something better than the alternative. You don't know. On Thursday, Ward takes you to a meeting. This is unusual. Ward goes to meetings. He's on 3 committees and has more correspondence than you've met in your entire life. But he rarely takes you. You are, in his professional social world, somewhere between an instrument and a junior colleague, and the distinction has never been fully specified. This meeting is at a private rooms above a coffee house on the Strand. 6 men, including Ward, tablecloth, coffee, a plate of biscuits that nobody touches. The room is lit by a gas fixture and has the slightly formal smell of a space used for official purposes. Ink, paper, a hint of boot polish. The man at the head of the table is Arthur Hassel. You've read everything Hassel has published. His 3-year investigation for The Lancet, running from 1851, is the most extensive systematic analysis of English food adulteration ever conducted. He tested over 2,000 samples. He published his results with a directness that caused, as Ward described, significant consternation in the relevant trades. In person, he's smaller than you expected. A compact, energetic man in his late 40s, with quick eyes and the restless quality of someone who is thinking about 6 things simultaneously. He greets Ward by first name, looks at you briefly, and asks Ward who you are. "My assistant," Ward says. "Thomas Marsh. He's been doing excellent field collection and preliminary analysis." Hassel looks at you again. More carefully this time. "How old are you?" he asks. 19, sir." "What's in the bread?" The question is so direct and uncontextualized that for a moment you don't answer. Then you realize it's a test. Alum, chalk, calcium sulfate primarily, some calcium phosphate possibly from bone, between 8 and 40% by weight depending on district and price point. Bean flour, occasionally plaster of Paris in the worst samples. The alum concentration is sufficient to cause intestinal irritation with regular consumption, particularly in children and the elderly. Hassel nods once. "What's in the gin?" "The batch we tested most recently. Sulfuric acid. Oil of vitriol, at concentrations consistent with acidification to simulate the bite of properly rectified spirit. Lead acetate at concentrations producing a white precipitate with the lead acetate test, correlated with... You stop. With a clinical presentation that Dr. Gallagher on Holborn described as potentially consistent with acute lead toxicity in a woman in his practice who consumed this gin regularly. The room is quiet for a moment. Good, Hasal says. He turns to the table as a whole. This is what I've been saying for 5 years. The problem is not isolated. It's not a few bad actors. It's structural. The market incentivizes it. The law does nothing to prevent it, and the people who suffer it are the people with the least ability to protect themselves. He pours himself coffee, and then, almost as an afterthought, pours a cup and slides it toward you. You're not sure if this is significant. In this room, in this company, you think it might be. You drink the coffee. It's real coffee. You can tell. After 14 months of testing coffee samples that turn out to be roasted chicory and grounder corns and burnt grain and, in one memorable case, a significant proportion of what Ward identified as roasted and ground horse liver, real coffee has a particular, immediate quality that you've come to appreciate. It tastes like honesty, if honesty had a flavour. I want to tell you about the people doing this, because it's important, and because the story is incomplete without them. The easy version of this history, the satisfying version, is that there were villains, deliberate, cynical poisoners who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't care. And some of them were that. Absolutely, some of them knew exactly what they were doing. But a lot of them were something more complicated. Ward's investigation reaches, over the course of the months you're working with him, into the supply chains behind the food you've been testing. He sends you to interview a baker on Bermondsey Street. A real interview with a notebook on Ward's headed paper. The baker, a man in his 50s named James Pollard, red-faced and flour-dusted with hands like 2 outward-facing shovels, sits across from you in his back office and talks. He knows about the chalk. Of course he knows about the chalk. Everyone adds chalk, he says, not defensively, just stating a fact. The flour merchants add it before we ever see it. The millers add it. By the time I get the flour, there's chalk in it already. And then you add more, you say, because the records suggest this. He looks at you. He's not stupid. He's tired. If I don't, my loaves come out dark. They look smaller than my competitors. His loaves are whiter and bigger, and they cost the same, and the customers buy from him. And your competitor is also adding chalk. Yes. So the customer is getting chalk from both of you. Yes. He folds his hands on the table. His knuckles are cracked and white with flour. I don't like it, he says. You want me to say that? I don't like it. My wife buys bread elsewhere for our own family. Our children don't eat the shop bread. You write this down. Is there anything you could do differently? If there were a law against it, he says, a real law with a real penalty. If my competitor couldn't add chalk, I wouldn't have to. You can't ask one baker to stop when all the others keep going. I'd be out of business in a month. He's right, and you know he's right, and Ward knows he's right. The problem isn't individual wickedness, or not only that. The problem is a system with no break. The confectioner is more troubling. The young man with the cheerful face and the bright-coloured sweets. Ward traces back through the supply chain and discovers that his colours come from a dye supplier who knows what he's selling and to whom, and who has offered, In a documented letter that Ward somehow obtained, you've never asked how, a more expensive, non-toxic alternative colouring, which the confectioner declined on grounds of price. He knew then. He chose the cheaper option, the one with the lead and the copper and the arsenic, the children with the red tongues, the farthings on the tray. He knew. In February 1856, 3 months into your second year with Ward, something changes. It doesn't feel like something changing. It feels like a Tuesday. You're at the bench doing the fat content estimation on a series of butter samples. Butter is another rich field of adulteration involving tallow, water, and a substance called oleomargarine that is being sold as butter at prices that suggest the vendor considers the distinction minor. When Ward comes in from outside and says, "Parliamentary committee," you look up. There's to be a select committee inquiry into adulteration of food and drink. They've been pushed to it by Hassel's published work and by the accumulation of data. The pile, Ward says. The pile has gotten large enough. He sits down. He looks for a moment like a man who's been pushing on a very large door for a very long time and has just felt it move. "They'll want to hear evidence," he says. "All of us. Hassal, myself, possibly you as a field operative. They'll want the data in a format that politicians can follow, which means," he says with a particular expression, "simplified. You understand. You've seen the notebooks, the colour-coded maps, the crystal diagrams, the pages of titration calculations and microscopic drawings. All of it is evidence. All of it is rigorous. All of it represents hundreds of hours of work. None of it is readable by a man who last studied chemistry 30 years ago and has been a member of Parliament since. I'll prepare summaries, you say. Yes." Ward stands up again. He's never still for long. The gin findings especially, the clinical correlation, the Gallagher data, he pauses. "Thomas." "Sir." "Good work, this year, all of it." You don't know what to say. Ward has told you your drawings are good. He's told you your analysis is precise. He's not previously said anything this direct. "Thank you," you say. He nods and goes to the bench. The moment passes, but something has shifted. April comes, and the samples change character. Not the adulteration. That doesn't change. But the products change. Spring brings new food, new markets, new things to test. Strawberries coloured with dye to look riper than they are. New season vegetables preserved with copper. Cream from suburban dairies, some of which are, and you discover this in the field when you trace a milk supply back to source, operated by cows that are housed in conditions that Ward describes as incompatible with the production of anything a reasonable person would classify as food. You also find in a sample of confectioner's cream from a respectable-looking shop in Covent Garden, a shop with a glass front and a hand-painted sign and prices that suggest quality, a significant concentration of what the subsequent shift test confirms as formaldehyde. The shop is not in the poor quarter. The shop sells to people who can afford to buy cream from a respectable-looking establishment in Covent Garden. The adulteration you're finding doesn't stop at the poverty line. It just changes character. The rich get formaldehyde to extend the shelf life of their cream. The poor get chalk to extend the weight of their bread. The mechanisms are different. The profits are different. The medical consequences are different. But the fundamental logic, reduce cost, increase margin, trust that the customer cannot tell, is the same. You test the cream 3 times because you want to be certain. You're certain by the second test. The third is for the completeness of the record. The record at this point is 3 large notebooks, densely filled, plus Ward's own parallel series of documentation, cross-referenced, indexed, and occupying a locked cabinet in the laboratory hall. The locked cabinet has become, in your private thinking of it, the archive of a crime. A slow, distributed, largely invisible crime committed over decades against the people who can least afford protection from it. The Adulteration of Food and Drink Act will eventually pass. Not quickly. The Parliamentary Committee will deliberate. The drafts will be argued over. The food trade solicitors will be very busy. The Act that passes in 1860 will be weak. It will allow local authorities to appoint inspectors, but it won't compel them to, and it won't specify penalties that anyone particularly fears. But it's a beginning. The door has moved. You won't know it yet in April 1856. You're just testing the cream. You're writing the number in the notebook. Your hand is getting better at the chemical shorthand Ward taught you in the first month. You can write a full analytical sequence in a quarter of the space it used to take. Your handwriting is still appalling, but the drawings are excellent. Somewhere in the middle of spring, you ask Ward a question you've been carrying since October. It's not during testing. It's in the afternoon, when the March light is actually doing something useful for once, coming through the north windows at a low angle and making the instruments on the bench look almost beautiful. The glass surfaces catching the light and scattering it in small fragments across the wall. Ward is writing a letter at his desk in the corner. His pen makes small, precise sounds. Dr. Ward. Yes. The woman from Argyle Street. The mother. Meg's mother. You pause. Do you know what happened to her? The pen pauses. I made an inquiry through Gallagher, Ward says, in November. And? She recovered from the acute episode. She was discharged. He resumes writing. Whether she's still? He stops. I don't know, Thomas. I don't know what she's doing now. A pause. She likely continued to purchase gin from the same source, you say, not as an accusation, as a fact. Likely. Ward sets down his pen. This is the tell. When Ward sets down his pen mid-letter, something has his full attention. The substance she's addicted to is the substance that's poisoning her. The shop is convenient and cheap. She has no information about its composition. She couldn't have our information, you say? No, unless the information were public. Yes, unless someone published it in a form that... Yes, Ward says, which is precisely what we're trying to accomplish. He picks up his pen, which is why we test, which is why we record, which is why we're preparing evidence for a parliamentary committee. The answer to the question you're not quite asking is, yes, all of this matters. Yes, it moves slowly. Yes, that's brutal. He writes a sentence. Keep testing. You go back to the bench. You keep testing. In May, the beer samples arrive. A colleague of Ward's from a medical practice in Southwark, a man named Dr. Brennan, who has been quietly collecting his own data, sends 6 sealed bottles with a note that reads, simply, these were all purchased within 3 streets of my practice. I think you should look at them. Ward looks at them. You look at them. The first thing you do is taste them, a small drop on the tongue, because Ward says there's no substitute for direct organoleptic assessment, and you've learned to do it carefully and spit immediately after. Beer should be bitter, hops, clean bitterness, a particular botanical astringency, the kind you recognise from a glass of honest ale. The third bottle has a different bitterness, sharper, mineral, more at the back of the throat. You spit. Look at Ward. He's already watching you. Something's wrong with number 3. Yes, Ward says. What does it taste like? Bitter, but not hops. More alkaline. More, you think. More like the taste of an acid salt. Ward nods. He runs the test himself. A Vitali reaction, a specific colour test for alkaloids. He adds reagent to a measured portion of the sample, watches it, watches the colour develop. Purple, then deepening purple. He looks up. Strychnos nux vomica, he says. Strychnine. The word sits in the room. Strychnine, the poison. The rat poison. Literally the compound used in rat poisoning preparations, extracted from the seeds of the nux vomica tree. A compound that causes convulsions and respiratory failure by interfering with the inhibitory neurotransmitters in the spinal cord. In the beer, you say. Why? Because it's cheap and it's bitter, Ward says, in the voice he uses for facts that disgust him. Hops are the traditional bittering agent in English beer, and hops cost money. Strychnine produces bitterness at a much lower concentration and costs, in the quantities being used here, almost nothing. And in the quantities used below the acute fatal threshold, in a healthy adult who isn't drinking multiple pints a day, it produces something else. He's looking at the bottle. It produces a mild stimulant effect, a slight heightening of sensation. The drinker doesn't know what they're feeling, but they like the beer that produces it. They come back. He pauses. It's the oldest mechanism in adulteration. Make the customer physiologically dependent on the wrong ingredient. But if someone is unwell, you say, if someone already has a condition, if someone drinks a lot, then the threshold is lower, Ward says. Then the convulsions occur at a quantity that an ordinary drinker might reach. Has anyone? There are deaths recorded that may be attributable to this. Hard to prove. The symptoms of strychnine poisoning can mimic tetanus in the early presentation. A drinker who convulses and dies. The question of whether strychnine was in the last pint he drank is not typically the first question asked. He picks up the bottle and puts it carefully in the rack. Bottle number 3, he says, and probably others of the 6. Write it up. Brennan's letter goes in the file. I'll run confirmatory tests tomorrow. You pick up your pen. Your hand is perfectly steady. You've been doing this long enough that the horror has changed its character. It hasn't gone away. You don't think it should go away. You think the day it goes away is the day to worry. But it's changed from shock to something harder. Something that goes directly into the writing. You write, Strychnine alkaloid confirmed by Vitali reaction. Positive purple coloration consistent with presence of brucine coalkaloid. Sample number 3. Supplier unknown. Suffolk, May 1856. You date it. You sign it. You put it in the record. The record grows. By summer, the wall map has been updated 7 times. The coloured marks have multiplied. The key in the bottom right corner lists 13 different adulterants with their symbols, from the commonplace, chalk, a white square, to the specific, strychnine, a black triangle, used only 3 times so far, each time in beer or gin. Ward has been before the Parliamentary Committee twice. You've prepared 4 summary documents and 1 full evidentiary presentation, which runs to 32 pages and includes 27 of your microscope drawings. When Ward comes back from the second committee appearance, he's quiet in a different way than usual. Not the quiet of working through a problem, a different quiet. They were surprised, he says eventually, by the scope of it. I think they genuinely didn't know. Or they knew in the way that people know things they haven't had demonstrated to them directly. He sits down. One of the members, a man from Yorkshire, asked how long this had been going on. What did you tell him? I told him that Occam documented it in 1820, and before Occam, a physician named Smethurst wrote about adulteration in the 1740s, and before that, bread has been adulterated since there was bread to adulterate and a market to sell it in. Ward looks at the wall map. The question isn't how long. The question is what we're going to do about it now. The committee will report in September. The report will recommend legislation. The legislation will be drafted by people who understand legislation better than they understand chemistry. And the first version will be inadequate. And Ward will write letters about the inadequacy. And Hassall will write letters. And Brennan will write letters. And gradually, incrementally, the inadequacy will be reduced. This is not a story about a dramatic moment of triumph. There isn't one. There's a wall map, and 47 notebooks, and a parliamentary committee and letters. So many letters, and the slow, determined accumulation of evidence against a set of practices that are profitable and legal and killing people gradually. This is what the work looks like. The evenings are long now. June light stays until almost 9, and after the coal smoke of winter, the air has a comparative clarity that feels, if you don't examine it too closely, almost clean. You've taken to walking by the river on the evenings when Ward lets you out at a reasonable hour. Not the central embankment, that's under construction, the great sewerage project that will eventually transform the city's relationship with its own waste, but the quieter stretches west, where you can lean on a wall and look at the water. The Thames at evening in June, ships, the flat silver light on the water, the calling of the river birds, the wheeling gulls that have never been far from this city. You think on these walks about food, not analytically, not professionally, just about food, what you're eating, what your colleagues are eating, what the people in the houses across the river are eating tonight for supper. You've become, and you know this, you see it happening, a man who looks at food differently than other people. Every meal is, at some background level, a question. Every bread roll is an implicit query about its flour source. Every cup of tea is a candidate for microscopy. This is both useful and, Mrs. Crane has told you, a bit of a strange way to be. She's right, it is a strange way to be. But then again, you know things most people don't know, and knowing them matters. Not for you personally. Your own food choices are, within the limits of a 19-year-old's income in 1856, guided by what you've learned. You buy the more expensive bread when you can. You've stopped buying cheap tea. You drink water that comes from a relatively trustworthy source and ale from a pub where Ward has tested the supply. But most people can't do this. Most people don't have 14 months of analytical chemistry at their back. Most people don't have access to Ward's wall map. Most people just buy the bread and trust it. And the trust is not currently warranted. That's why the records matter. That's why the Parliamentary Committee matters. That's why every bread sample and every vial of gin and every paper twist of chalk-contaminated pepper goes into the locked cabinet in the hall. Because evidence accumulates. Because data has weight. Because a pile of facts, if you stack it long enough, eventually falls on something. The evenings get shorter again as autumn returns. September, October, and the laboratory fills once more with the smell of coal smoke and chemicals. The Parliamentary Committee has reported. The report is, as Ward predicted, inadequate. The recommended legislation permits local inspectors but does not compel them, allows penalties but sets them at levels insufficient to deter the more prosperous adulterators. Ward is already writing the follow-up letters, but the report exists. The committee has acknowledged formally in a document that will be read and archived and referred to that food adulteration in England is systemic, widespread, and harmful. That didn't exist before Ackham. That didn't exist before Hassel's investigations or Ward's or the 47 notebooks in the locked cabinet. You're preparing samples one October afternoon, the tea for a new series of tests, 8 samples from different districts, each with its own particular character. When Ward says, without looking up from his writing, "I've recommended you to Hassel," you put down the pipette. For what? For a position. He's establishing a small analytical practice, separate from the Lancet work, taking on private clients, municipal authorities, medical societies, large employers who want independent food testing for their canteens. Ward finally looks up. It would be a proper paid position, not apprentice pay, analytical chemist's assistant with a formal contract. You look at him. He's looking back at you with the expression he usually reserves for microscope work. Precise, focused, assessing. You'd be doing what you're doing, here, he says, but with more resources, more scope, and a salary that would allow you to pay Mrs. Crane in advance rather than 2 weeks behind, which she has mentioned to me. She's talked to you? She ran into me on Holborn. He seems to find something marginally amusing in this, though his expression doesn't change much. She's fond of you. She described you as the serious young man with the peculiar smell. The acid, you say? Yes, Thomas. He sets down his pen, the full attention again. You came here with 32 shillings and a letter that described your skills as adequate. In 14 months you've done work that will appear, properly attributed, in the evidentiary record submitted to Parliament. Your methodology is precise. Your documentation is thorough. Your field collection is excellent. A pause. Your handwriting is still catastrophic, but your drawings compensate. Is that a recommendation, you ask? It is, Ward says. From me to Hassel, and from both of us to whatever future you're building. He picks up his pen again. The conversation is, in Ward's terms, concluded. You stand there for a moment with the pipette in your hand. Out the window the October light is gold and cold, the trees in Lincoln's Inn Fields reduced to their skeletons. You came to London with 32 shillings. You still have less than that in your coat pocket, the analytical chemistry pay scale being what it is. But you have the notebooks, you have the methodology, you have the wall map of London's adulterated food supply, annotated in 2 colours of ink, and the knowledge of how to read it. You have the work. That's not nothing. That turns out to be something considerable. October night. You're in your room on Cursitor Street. The fire is going. You've learned to keep it going, because the cold in this room is not the kind you should try to endure for principle's sake. And the candle is burning on the small table under the window. Your notebooks are on the table. Not the official ones from the laboratory. Those are in the cabinet on Little Queen Street. These are the personal ones, the ones you started in the first month when you needed to process what you were learning somewhere outside of Ward's clean precision. They're full now, 3 of them, filled with the handwriting that Mrs. Crane once described as like a cat fell in an ink pot and ran, and the drawings, genuinely good drawings. Ward said so. Hassel said so last month. And you've come to believe it. Crystal structures of adulterated substances. Microscope slides of wheat flour with chalk particles. The geometry of a lead acetate precipitate. a girl on a doorstep in Argyle Street, which you drew from memory in October and which you've never shown anyone. You close the notebooks. Outside, London continues its nighttime work. A cart on the street below, the sound of iron wheels on stone, the rhythmic knock of a horse's hooves, a woman's voice somewhere rising and cutting off, distant music from a tavern, something with a fiddle, imprecise at this distance. The city that makes and distributes 3 million people's daily meals, most of them adulterated to some degree, some of them poisonous. The city that is also building a sewerage system, conducting parliamentary inquiries, employing analytical chemists, publishing findings in medical journals, accumulating the pile. Both things at once, both things simultaneously. The place that puts chalk in bread and the place that is, slowly, getting around to stopping it. You can hold both of those things now. You couldn't a year ago. You blow out the candle. The darkness of a November London night comes in, which is not full darkness. There's always some ambient light, some reflection of the gas lamps from the low clouds, some seeping orange edge around the curtain. The fire makes small sounds. The city makes its small sounds. You've eaten tonight. Mrs. Crane made a stew from a recipe she's apparently been using since before you were born, and it was substantial and probably fine, and you were, for the first time in some time, not thinking about what was in the food while eating it. Just eating. That felt like progress. Your fingers still smell faintly of acid. They always smell faintly of acid. You lie down on the narrow bed and look at the ceiling, which is the same grey ceiling it's been since October of last year, slightly water-stained in the corner, a crack running from the window frame toward the centre that Mrs. Crane assures you is settling, not structural. You believe her. You've also looked at the supporting wall. Your eyes are heavy. Tomorrow is another morning, another round of samples, another set of tests. Ward wants the dairy work expanded. There's a new series of milk samples coming in from a contact in Lambeth. Brennan has sent what might be a preliminary lead in the sauce trade. Bottled sauces sold as genuine Indian preparations that may contain, the preliminary work suggests, a combination of ingredients that nobody who lived in India had a hand in producing. The work continues. The pile grows. And for now, for this hour, you're warm enough and fed enough and tired in the good way. The way that comes from doing something that matters, even slowly, even without immediate visible results, even in a city that is vast and complicated and frequently trying to poison itself. You're becoming something. Not the adequate young man with the catastrophic handwriting from Nottingham. Something being shaped by this city and this work and these notebooks. Something that knows the weight of evidence and the patience it requires and the particular, specific anger that doesn't go away when you look at a paper twist of brick dust being sold as cayenne pepper to a woman who is counting pennies. Something that keeps testing anyway. That's enough for tonight. This city settles. Somewhere out there, the gin shops are still open. The bread for tomorrow is already mixed, and the chalk is already in the dough, and the baker is thinking about his competitor. The pea vendor is soaking tomorrow's stock in copper sulfate. The tea merchants are rolling used leaves and adding colour. All of it going on tonight, in the dark, in 100 small workrooms and back kitchens and storage cellars. And in a laboratory on Little Queen Street, a locked cabinet with 48 notebooks, you wrote up 2 today, and a wall map covered in coloured marks, and the evidence of everything that has been seen and tested and recorded. Tomorrow a Member of Parliament will read a summary document that you wrote. He'll read a sentence about lead acetate in cheap gin and think about it. He may or may not do anything. The process may be slow, but the sentence exists. The test was run. The number was recorded. That's the work. The slow, careful, infuriating, essential work of knowing what's in things and writing it down until someone who can change it has to acknowledge they've been told. It's not dramatic. It doesn't have a clean ending. But centuries will pass, and the food will get safer, not by accident, not by the sudden goodwill of merchants, but by the accumulation of exactly this: tests, records, evidence, arguments, incremental legislation, imperfect but real. The Act of 1860, the Act of 1872 that was stronger, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 that gave teeth to what had been toothless. Each one built on the notebooks of the people who came before, each one a stone in a building that the people who laid the first stones never saw finished. That's the shape of it. That's what the work looks like from outside time. From inside time, from a narrow bed on Cursitor Street in October 1856, it looks like acid on your fingers, cold on the floorboards in the morning, a wall map with too many marks on it, a child on a doorstep and a mother who recovered and probably went back to the same gin shop and probably bought the same bottle, and tomorrow more samples. The church bell strikes midnight somewhere not too far away. One clear note, then gone. You close your eyes. Let the sounds of the city go soft and far. Let the weight of the day settle. Let your hands rest. Those stained, tired, precise hands that have held pipettes and vials and a child's paper bag of copper-dyed sweets and a flask of gin that contains something that should never be in gin. Let the thinking slow. You've done the work. You've written the number. The evidence is in the cabinet, and the cabinet is locked, and the key is in Ward's desk, and tomorrow the work continues. Let that be enough for tonight. Let sleep come the way it came to every analyst who ever stayed too late testing samples, every field collector who ever walked too many markets, every person who ever spent their days looking closely at the world's small dishonesty and writing them precisely down. You're warm enough. You're fed enough. You're doing something that matters, even slowly, even in the dark. That's more than enough. That's everything. Sleep now. The city will be here in the morning. The work will be here in the morning. And the morning, when it comes, will start the same as always. Your eyes opened. The ceiling, grey and familiar. The smell of acid on your fingers. The faint light of a London dawn. And the knowledge, carried now in the body, not just the mind, of exactly what is in the bread. Good night.